It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Milton Chen. You've all had a chance, perhaps, to read his biography, and you can see that his 4-decade career has been spent as an innovator in pre-K-12 education. But there are a few things about Milton that you may not know. He has been honored by some of the most important names in education, notably receiving the Elmo Award from the Sesame Workshop and the Fred Rogers Award from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, to honor an individual like Mr. Rogers who has contributed to excellence in children's media. He is a member of the National Park System Advisory Board and was named an honorary park ranger in 2016. He serves on the boards of the Panasonic Foundation, the Sesame Workshop, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Dr. Chen's 2010 book, Education Nation: 6 Leading Edges of Innovation in Our Schools, was selected as one of the year's 10 best education books by the American School Board Journal. His work as the executive director of the George Lucas Educational Foundation and Edutopia led George Lucas to name Dr. Chen, this is impressive, as a Jedi Master upon the occasion of his 50th birthday. Congratulations on that. The rank of Jedi Master is shared with Obi-Wan Kenobi and other powerful Jedi who are able to harness the power of the Force. Tonight, all the way from California, with stops on Sesame Street in a galaxy far, far away, we welcome Dr. Milton Chen to Shawnee Mission.
Thank you, Mike. I've also, just in one day, experienced a very warm welcome from you all here in Shawnee Mission. And it's a pleasure, Mike, to be part of this inaugural Distinguished Leaders event, to welcome you and your new leadership here in the district. So it's a very exciting day, and I really enjoyed meeting the teachers and speaking with the teachers, sharing some of our work at edutopia.org, which is our website of the George Lucas Educational Foundation, and also meeting the students, your student leaders, who there's no question in the next decade or 2 or 3, they will be leaders in your community, inventing the future. I like Alan Kay's a futurist statement about the future, that it's not something that is done to you, that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And your student leaders are helping you create a new future for learning here, with your schools, with your community here in Shawnee Mission. So it is a great pleasure to be here. And thank you for playing the theme music from my previous lives. There was a slide of my wife and myself in front of the White House. I'm wearing that honorary park ranger hat. I'm glad Ruth is not here, because Ruth is famous for saying, can we just have one day, just one day, where no one says anything about Star Wars? A Star Wars-free day. But it's always it's in the air, it's in the music, it's on television. And I know you're tracking this information about the 9th Star Wars film coming out, due to film in England soon. The new news, breaking news, that Mark Hamill will be back for the 9th, episode 9. So I know you're tracking this. So. Yes, very exciting. So I've titled my talk in the interest of talking about this movement towards personalized learning. You know, when we were in school, no one really said anything about personalized learning. But now we're in a day and age where we can think about creating a personal learning path for every student, depending on their interests, depending on their background, their family, their community. So I like to talk about education, Y-O-U-U, as the learner at the center of your education. Is that possible? Could we create that? You saw an earlier slide with this photo of, 1982 on the Great Wall of China, one of my early experiences working with Sesame Workshop on a co-production called Big Bird in China, which apparently is still out there on YouTube. You can see snippets of it. This is a little young Chinese kindergartner from Beijing who was cast as a friend of Big Bird, showing her the the Great Wall and the culture, the landmarks of China. I mentioned to some of the teachers, I'm trying to spend more time in the last decade of my career working on this U.S.-China educational exchange. I think it's very important, this kind of citizen-to-citizen exchange, while our politicians are trying to figure out the role of U.S. and China in a political way, in an economic way. Very important that we have more educational exchange. So if that's of interest, and we'll have some time to have some Q&A at the end, love to hear your thoughts about that. I am standing before you as a product of a very small window of time where my parents could come from China to the U.S. At the end of World War II, my father was able to come to the U.S., returning GIs, also coming back for study. He was able to enroll at Penn State, where the president of Penn State was Milton Eisenhower. So there you have a little fun factoid about me and who I was named after. My Chinese name is Ming Da, which means bright and kind of virtue, I guess. Da is virtue. But my parents decided to stay in this country and said, well, we need to give our son an American name. What's it going to be? And since the Chinese revere education, they said, let's name him after that college president at Penn State who handed my father Wen his degree when he graduated. So you may have noticed it is the 50th anniversary of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which began broadcast on PBS 50 years ago. There's a new film, a documentary about his life. Has anyone seen it? Won't You Be My... That's amazing. Won't You Be My Neighbor, a documentary about Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, is now the most watched, the most profitable, independent, biographical documentary of all time. It's amazing. Here is the originator of social emotional learning, talking directly to preschoolers about how special they were, how it's important to express your feelings. I had a chance working in public television to meet Fred Rogers and to work with him on the creation of a new center. It's not so new anymore, about 10 years old, called the Fred Rogers Center in his hometown in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. We were talking earlier about golf. Some of you are golfers, apparently, and I married into a golfing family, so it's kind of an obsession, right? Latrobe, Pennsylvania is famous for three things. Those of you who are golfers will know one of them. Hometown of Fred Rogers, Arnold Palmer, and Rolling Rock beer. Those are the three things. So, at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, there is a beautiful building, the Fred Rogers Center, where we have graduate students, mid-career professionals on fellowship learning to take forward Fred Rogers' legacy about social emotional learning into the media, into schools, into curriculum. So we're continuing his legacy. I always like to talk about the whole child and really to understand there are many ways in which we're all smart. Schools traditionally have just focused on the first two, the verbal and the math. We test on those subjects. What about the other six? The visual intelligence. I talked this morning about George Lucas having this visual intelligence, this visual interest as a boy that he was not able to use until he was in graduate school at USA Film School. The musical intelligence. These are intelligences located in the brain through neuroscience. Professor Howard Gardner at Harvard wrote a book called Frames of Mind, initially in the 1980s, about these intelligences. The bodily kinesthetic intelligence, people who are good in moving, athletes, dancers, choreographers. The intrapersonal, knowing yourself. The interpersonal, good at working with other people. Both valuable skills for the modern workplace where people are working together in teams to create something larger. You're not a factory worker anymore working on one repetitive task. You're working with teams to do something larger than you could do on your own. And lastly, a new intelligence discovered in the past decade. Howard Gardner added this intelligence, the naturalist intelligence, people who are good in nature, who love being in nature, love plants and animals. Veterinarians, people who love pets, gardeners. So I ask you to think about the whole child and how we can now educate kids who have different intelligences. So here's what happens when we only emphasize two of them. Here lies Frederick Jones, and he probably went to a pretty good college because his test scores were pretty good, right? But we need to recognize, of course, that he was more than just his 2 test scores. There's a persistent achievement gap in our country. I like to call it an experience gap. And I like to think about education as a set of experiences that students undertake as they go through their learning. To have experiences, it means not only learning in school, but also in your community, outside of school. You have an urban farm in this district, wonderful. To experience gardening, the culinary work that's going on here. It was wonderful to visit the Center for Academic Achievement. Students with the latest tools in biotech, in CAD, computer-aided design, in health sciences, being able to work with robots and dummies who give off different signals about their physical health. These are tools, again, that used to be in medical schools and then maybe came into colleges, and your students now have access to the most cutting-edge digital tools for learning. That's all helping bolster their experiences as they go through their learning lives. Some students have experiences that are out of whack with what they need to be learning. We, in the Bay Area, have a group of programs that send kids into national parks for residential programs, really an entire week spent in Yosemite or spent in the Marin Headlands, camping, staying in dorms, experiencing nature, looking at the ecosystem, real hands-on experiences. For many of the young people coming out of urban situations, it's their first time camping. In fact, for their youth leaders from a city like Oakland, California, it's the first time camping for their youth leaders who are leading them from a Boys and Girls Club or a YMCA. One Oakland teacher told me this, that these are boys in middle school who carry guns, but they're afraid of bugs. So these are young men who have their experience portfolio unbalanced, and we need to rebalance their experience portfolio through these positive learning experiences. I like to talk about a new learning ecosystem that includes schools, colleges, universities, traditionally the places where you went for an education, but so many other nonprofits, community-based organizations. I mentioned the YMCAs, the Boys and Girls Clubs, scouting, libraries, businesses. You have a number of businesses involved with helping to mentor and provide work-based experiences for students. That really helps bolster their experience portfolio. Some work going on in churches as well, youth groups. I mentioned national parks. Certainly art museums. You have wonderful art museums, science centers. These are all part of this greater learning ecosystem where students can go through and collect learning experiences. So when it comes to placing you at the center of your education, I like to ask kids to really learn about themselves. Usually the curriculum is something that curriculum developers design as something from a body of knowledge they think you as a student need to learn. But there are a lot of wonderful connections if we can help students understand between their own lives, their own families, their own communities, and that science curriculum, and that art curriculum, that math curriculum. So here are some basic questions that I hope all students will begin to really investigate. This helps motivate them, helps power their learning, leads them to understand the relevance of concepts that they're learning in school. Questions such as, who is your family? Who are you, really? I told you a little bit about my family, how I got here. It's something that I learned in my adult years. I never really understood how my parents got here, what their lives were like in China. One of the best things I've done as an adult is to sit down and interview my mother. She was by then in her 70s, about her early years in China as a girl. She lived in China until she was 30. Very rural existence, small villages. From time to time, she would mention things like, well, her mother, my grandmother, whom I never met, she made all the clothes for the entire family. They would just get cloth, and my grandmother made everything that they wore, including their shoes. That they had a cow that would help them, would be attached to a millstone and would grind the wheat to make bread for them. So from time to time, she would say these things, and I would say, wait a second. I want to sit down and understand this from the very beginning. What was it like? So I created a biography of my mother, and I've shared it with my nieces and nephews, my daughter, and hopefully their children, so they will understand where they come from. Who is their family, going back several generations? What's in your neighborhood? What are the places that you should know about in your own neighborhood? I'll just tell you quickly that I grew up in Chicago. I grew up in the Pullman district of Chicago. I went to the Pullman Library branch on the south side of Chicago. I had no idea what that word meant. You can learn a lot about your community, your neighborhood, just by looking what names are on things, what the streets are named after. So Pullman, and many of you will know this, living in the Midwest, George Pullman. His role in creating modern train transportation, luxury train travel, right there in my neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. Helping to create the first African-American union of Pullman porters. So that is now a national park site, one of our newest national parks. You can go there and learn this history, learn the history of labor unions, learn the history of technology and train travel. So much that happened in Chicago a century ago. How does your body work? Where does your food and water come? These are becoming even more urgent questions for our students to understand as we begin to face crises around food, around water. Clean air and water are things that we've taken for granted for a long time. I've been talking with some of you about the California forest fires. This will affect the air quality in California for years to come. It's already affecting the air quality right now. And that last question, what are you good at? What would you like to be good at? Also an important question for our students to begin to answer. Since you have an urban farm, I'd like to show you this film because it talks about the different intelligences working together, the interpersonal intelligence, the naturalist intelligence. This is a story called The Edible Schoolyard from Berkeley, California. Some of you may know Alice Waters, who's been our California organic chef, been a real proponent of healthier eating, eating closer to nature, not so much processed foods, and again, it connects with health. And it's called the Edible Schoolyard because it is a seed-to-table experience. The students grow fruits and vegetables in the garden, then they learn to cook. So since we saw your culinary career academy today, it's a great skill. No matter where you go, you can find a job working in the culinary arts. I'll show you this film, and hope you enjoy it.
For most sixth graders, the day begins with the shuffling of paper and textbooks.
And then we're gonna put the weeds in a pile and with the compost.
But in this outdoor classroom at Martin Luther King Middle School in Berkeley, California, students spend their first period planting, harvesting,
Try that one.
and eating organic delights from their edible schoolyard.
Or you get some figs. Don't tell anyone.
Look at this. Now, where do you think this came from?
Right out
So, we're making little pumpkin pies. And the garden and the adjacent kitchen classroom are learning labs for social studies.
And this is a variety from France. The name of this is Musique de Provence. And that means the music of Provence.
Math,
If it calls for 1.5 cups of cooked pumpkin, and we're doubling the recipe, then how much do we need?
3. Science,
Why is it wet?
We've just been studying this.
Oh yeah, the rain.
The water cycle. What part of the water cycle? Why are there droplets? Abundance. Good.
and life.
We're also going to add some of the manure from that pile over there.
When you watch these kids in the garden classes, you see that the teachers just use every little drop of water or dew and every plant and every bed to teach.
It likes each other because it's a
contracted, surface tension. Look at the plug, Madra! So we've been studying that water molecules have a special bond that creates surface tension. And so we've been doing a series of experiments in the classroom. So it's nice to sort of see if you can play with it someplace else.
It seems effortless, but it isn't. It's a high art. It's almost like an artist who is a master violinist. It takes years and years of practice.
You understand?
So this is where we come in with the Center for Equiliteracy. We train teachers, and it takes a lot of preparation to make the garden the center of teaching. Because what you see here is only part of it. It goes on in the classroom.
Does anyone remember why we turned the compost pile up?
So the FBI can breathe and stuff.
What's the FBI?
F. Fungus, bacteria, insects. Compost. I like it because there are a lot of bugs and stuff. And I didn't know this little leaves. It's kind of like you turn it, it kind of dries out, and then about 1 month, they're kind of soil. It becomes soil, and we learn the cycle of compost. First it becomes kind of plants, then it becomes kind of dry, and the dry becomes kind of soil, then it becomes soil, and then you grow something, and then it's just start all over.
They're learning, first of all, the basics of ecology. They're learning about photosynthesis, the cycling of matter, the diversity that supports the resilience of an ecosystem. But what they're also learning is to cooperate, to do projects together, to build community. Another important thing is that the kid who is brilliant in math or science or languages will not necessarily be brilliant in gardening. And somebody who is not very articulate, but is very good with her hands or his hands, will be very happy in the garden and will gain in prestige among the class community.
So this is very hot, be careful. I poured it all in. Now mix it together very quickly.
The Edible Schoolyard concept is the brainchild of Alice Waters, who runs the renowned Chez Panisse restaurant in Berkeley.
I love them when they're mixed up.
She originally conceived the garden back in 1994 as a way to improve on school lunch programs.
This is a delicious revolution that we're talking about. This isn't hard to do. If they grow it, they cook it, they want to eat it. And that there's a whole range of foods that kids love.
See, just making it hot, just toasting it, gives it a different flavor.
The kids have been captivated by this experience, and you see them looking and smelling and tasting, and they don't think that this is school. Yet we know what they're learning, and it's very, very fundamental, important information. They all know how to make a vinaigrette for a salad. They all know what it is to set a table and to ask people to come and sit down and eat together and talk at the table. They're learning these values of concentration and generosity.
Beautiful. We're going to bring it right over here. Put it down.
I think for our students, the biggest benefit is being able to come to their senses, literally.
It's just like similar, it gives you like a warm feeling
It's kind of inside.
It's really nice.
I think that it's almost a sign of the times that we have a program like this to teach things that are so basic that people used to learn at home from their own families, and that's really not happening now. And it's a very dangerous thing to be that cut off from where your food comes from, knowing where it's grown, how did it get to wherever you buy it from. And it completes a circle for a lot of students who don't know the least little thing about nature and farming, and they get to see that whole cycle, and not just see it, but make it happen. They're the ones that are driving the garden. They're the ones that come in and make it all happen in the kitchen.
For closing circle, the question is, one word that describes your favorite part of the garden this season.
Harvesting. Guava and everything.
In middle school, they're just at the transition between childhood and adolescence.
The colors. Flower.
And there's still a lot of the sense of magic in those children.
Riding on a wheelbarrow.
And when they come to the garden, especially their garden, which they have planted and built themselves, they own that sense of magic. And so it is a very, very special place.
So I love that phrase about children need to come to their senses in their learning. That really says it all, that in many ways this is returning to an older style of education, a more agrarian style of education, but with a new twist. It's project-based learning that covers standards in English language arts, mathematics, science, and then also this collaborative work. Students are doing something, again, more ambitious than they could do working on their own. So I'm glad that you're already doing some of this work, and look forward to following it as it develops. There's some great examples of students who've gone through these career academies, and they start opening businesses. I wouldn't be surprised if, as you already have, a student-run restaurant that could help generate funds for the school district. We've had some discussions in the San Francisco area around having youth entrepreneur programs like that. I learned early on at Sesame Street that kids can do things earlier than we think they can, and I truly do believe that high school students in particular, sometimes middle school students, can do work of real economic value to their communities. Just as they did back in the days when they worked on farms, they can do that in this new learning economy. I want to show you a somewhat different film and close very quickly and then ask you for your questions and comments. We'll have a microphone that you can use. In this new digital world, things like programming and coding are very relevant, and we're now teaching even, can you believe it, preschoolers some basic ideas about computer programming. And for those of you who are not programmers, let me just say, who think that's a strange, esoteric concept, programming, of course, is just a series of instructions. And any of you, for instance, who are following a recipe, that's a program. It's a series of instructions of things that you need to do in a certain order, and sometimes there's a certain number of things you need to do to make a side dish or to make a sauce that you then apply to the larger thing that you're creating, meal. That's a computer program. And in some of these early programming projects with young kids, they don't actually start typing code. They are asked to think about the different steps it takes to accomplish a certain thing. So one of my favorite programming exercises was written by a young boy who wrote a flow chart of what does it take to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That's a computer program. That's something that you can tell a computer what to do when. And if you think about it, I remember the flow chart started, well, first of all, you need some peanut butter, some bread, and some jelly. Do you have those things? If not, go back and get those things. There's a certain way in which you organize the sandwich. You know the rest of that. But it's things like that that are intuitive to us that form the basis of computer programming. Sequential thinking, sometimes it's called. So, in this new age, there are many ways in which kids can apply programming concepts, again, to do things that formerly were only taught in universities, schools of engineering. So I want to show you an example of a young boy, Quinn, who is a maker kid. That means he can use technology of coding and programming, sometimes using these little devices, electronic devices, and send instructions to a 3D printer. Have any of you ever used a 3D printer? Because you've all used products that have been designed through 3D printing. And you'll see examples of it here. He was very lucky to be in the right family. When he was 10 years old, he went to a maker fair in San Mateo, California. And he got so excited about what you could now do as a 10-year-old boy. He started getting involved with these new digital tools. So I want to show you this film.
My name is Quinn, and I live on the central coast of California. I really like to do embedded electronics, soldering, hacking, 3D printing, and laser cutting. It's really cool seeing your project come to life. I used to do a lot of Lego stuff, like taking things apart, and a computer is something that you can easily take apart and sometimes not as easily put it back together. And so I got an interest in that, and I went to the Maker Fair in San Mateo in 2011 with my dad, and so there I got my first Arduino. This is the Arduino. This is the main board, the Uno, and this is the Make Edition for the Maker Fairs. So here I'm using my phone, and when I text it a certain command, like LED on, then it goes through the internet and comes back to the Arduino. The main thing that's special about this is that you can program it to do whatever you'd like. You can attach sensors such as light sensors and attach it also to LEDs or motors. Everything's open source, which means you can get everything for free online, and one by one I went online and looked at tutorials, and that's how I learned. This is a Weevil eye kit. I used a soldering iron and some solder to solder the kit, and basically solder is electric glue. And so I bond the circuits together using solder, and thus the wires would be connected inside this board. This could be used as a night light, so when the room is darker, then the lights would turn on, and as it went darker, then the lights would be brighter.
Well, I didn't know anything about the maker movement until I heard about Quinn. And it's pretty fun when you have a gem right there in your own district. It's pretty cool to have a student who's that curious and that into learning on his own, basically.
This is filament. This is a soldering iron. This is a Leatherman. These are solder supplies. These are breadboards. These are Arduinos. And this is my 3D printed logo.
Quinn came to one of our school board meetings and he talked to the school board about what he does with Arduinos and all those circuit boards and things, and really gave us his thoughts on how we need to be more engaging as a school district.
3D printer that I have is called a BucoBot. So here's the filament, and it's basically a spool of plastic, and it has the spool holder too. It goes all the way down into here, and this is the main extruder part. And so basically it melts it and it spits it out in the nozzle. This axis is the x-axis, so it moves side to side. This is the y, and right here and right here are the z-axis, and so these move up and down. First, you take your 3D model from tinkercad.com and download it into your host program. Then you slice it using the program called Slicer, and this basically turns the 3D model code into 3D printer code. And so the 3D printer code is basically a set of X, Y, and Z coordinates that my computer tells the 3D printer to do. Layer by layer, it prints a 3D object with filament.
The power, I think, of the maker movement is they're really focused on building something that they think is cool. They're not like, here's a math problem, you need to learn. No, here's a cool project, and I want to build that project. Oh, by the way, I need to learn about electricity and engineering principles. They're learning all these STEM kinds of things that are going to be helpful to them later on, but they're learning it in the context of something that's fun and interesting to them.
The hackerspace, I was teaching my friends how to solder, as well as teaching them how to use the tinkercad.com software to design their own keychain and 3D print it. Click on the box and change the one that goes up and down to 5. Or actually to 3. I really like to teach other people how to do embedded electronics and Arduino and stuff like that, because once I teach them, they can teach some of their friends, and that overall makes the maker community bigger, and everybody can help each other. Is it working?
Yeah.
Nice.
So notice it looks like that thing always stays in the same place, and then that board moves around.
Yeah, exactly. So the x-axis is like that, y is like that, and then z is.
I'm interested in this idea of makerspaces finding their way into schools and transforming a number of things. You know, the art studio connected to the computer lab, connected to the shop class, connected to the biotech lab. But the difference is, instead of directing students to do things, you're inviting them to create things and make things.
The self-confidence and sense of self-efficacy that I think students get from creating their own projects and seeing them be successful and seeing that they can do it, that I think is so powerful.
We are defined very much by our culture as consumers, and we're users in that sense. And what I'm trying to really affect is a transition from that mindset to one where you're a maker. The world around me isn't just something that was built for my use, it's something that I need to contribute to, and I can change that. If something isn't the way it should be, I have the power and the sense of control to be able to do that.
I look at everything a lot differently now, because now I can see what's in every electronic product, what's in a smartphone, every component in it, as well as what's in a computer. But other things such as skateboards, bicycles, I could see different ways on how to make it better so that other people could iterate on that design.
Yeah, so there's an example of a maker kid, a new role for students who are teaching each other, peer teaching, and as you saw with Quinn, teaching adults, teaching his school board about this new generation of tools that can be used. Wonderful that you have a makerspace here at the Center for Academic Achievement. Dale Doherty was featured in that film. There's a magazine called Make Magazine, for those of you, sometimes you'll see it on the newsstand. He's got a great book called Free to Make about these ideas. There's a maker education program, especially to help young people learn some of these skills. And there's no question, these are the skills that make students very employable. At the Chicago Public Library, Brian Bannon, the librarian there, created a makerspace in a library on the theory that libraries should be places of knowledge, and these are kind of the new knowledges that students need to. From the time it opened, it was standing room only, not just with young people, but with older people who are looking to get jobs and looking to learn these sorts of skills about 3D design and printing, and were immediately then hired by companies like Motorola. And after this little pilot project ended about 6 months, they said, well, what are we going to do now? Motorola said, we will fund this space. This space is actually creating the kind of employees that we want to hire. So a good example of how young people can learn these skills much more quickly. I showed this film in Ohio, and the educator said, well, we'd love to contact Quinn and see if he could come speak at our next conference for our teachers. I said, okay, I will put you in touch with Quinn. He lives on the central coast of California. This Ohio district calls up his family and says, we saw that film about Quinn, and we'd like for Quinn to come and, as he did with your school board, come and share some of these ideas with our school principals and teachers and school board. And his mother, who had answered the phone, said, well, Quinn would love to do that. But on that day, he's actually speaking at the Rome Maker Fair. He's 13 years old. But as you can tell, he has a great way of explaining what these concepts are. Well, I'll just close with my favorite question that was asked me by Paul Houston at the American Association of School Administrators. He said, you know, your website is full of great schools. What is your definition of a great school? And importantly, keep it short, not a long paragraph, but keep it concise. And how would you measure what a great school is? I said, well, you know, at Edutopia, we have all these great schools, and it's very clear within the first 10 minutes of being at a school site, the students are taking you around, they're excited to show you what they're learning, that they can articulate what their learning goals are. They can talk about the benefits of collaborative work, as you saw here. Paul Houston said, well, that's getting a little long. Could you make it a little shorter? And how would you measure that? How would you measure what a great school is? And I said, well, we're having a lot of trouble with measurement and assessment. You know, the tests don't measure everything. We're trying to come up with new measures for how students learn, measures of deeper learning, as we call it. He said, okay, that's fine, that's fine. Here is Paul Houston's definition of what a great school is. It's short and it is measurable. Do the students run in at the same rate that they run out? That's it. That's all we need to know. Because what this means is they are so eager to get to school because they want to learn what they're going to learn there. It's very engaging. And at the end of the school day, they're so engaged, they don't want to leave. Or they're a little slow to leave. I've been in these schools. The parents are lining up to pick up their kids, and the parents are telling it's time to go, and the students say, well, could you wait a second? I'm working on a presentation we're supposed to give tomorrow. I need like 15 more minutes. That's the definition of great school. And I'm very pleased to be part of this speaker series to launch your new school year with a new superintendent, new leadership, to create more of these kinds of great schools. So thank you very much. And I would love to hear some of your questions or comments about these ideas, or maybe other things that you'd like to talk about.
Does anyone have a question? Oh, come on. You met with a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds today who had some pretty incredible questions.
They are not shy.
So maybe we should ask some of their questions.
Yes.
So what is your best advice for a high schooler for their next step and what they should do to ensure
that was a
their
very good
success?
question she asked. I told her that in this day and age, it's very important to learn a lot about a lot of different things. Don't pigeonhole yourself too narrowly. Don't specialize too early. Learn as much as you can about a lot of different things. So, for instance, we tend to think of the arts and humanities as one body of knowledge, and maybe science, STEM, science, technology, engineering, math as another thing. And these two worlds don't connect, right? Students specialize in STEM, or they specialize in history, English, the arts. I like students that do both. And I was talking a little bit earlier because one of the students was interested in attending Stanford. Stanford has come around to describing that student as the T student. A student is very broad across the top of the T in interest. They're interested in visiting the art museum even though they work in technology. They're interested in learning more about history even though they're interested in applied mathematics. And then the vertical part of the T, they're very good at certain things, at a small number of things. So maybe they're a great athlete. Maybe they're a science fair winner. Maybe they've written poetry or composed music. Very accomplished at the end of high school in a few things, but still very broad across the top of the T. And as Stanford admissions people say, that's the hard part. They have trouble finding students who have kind of Renaissance learners. They're interested in a lot of different things. They're curious about a lot of different things. I think that frame of mind, that habit of being curious about many different things is the best preparation for a future.
With regards to Edutopia and creating these different schools, how do you go about, from a traditional education standpoint, where we have to teach our kids math, science, and English, to recognizing which kids are different and that learn differently, and try to make those things available to them, because all kids may not go to college, may not want to go to college, may not even need to go to college. How do you decide that as a parent or as a school board, or when you're making those tough decisions on how you educate a larger group?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we advocate for is changing the curriculum to be much more authentic. So, as we were suggesting earlier, students are studying topics of real-world relevance. They can see how this applies to their own communities, their own lives. Again, with your career academies, health sciences, there are career academies for finance, for the law. So getting exposure, certainly in the high school years, about the real world of work, and then being able to understand then how the math, the science, the English, language arts applies in that world of work. That's very helpful for students to see that connection. And project-based learning, as you saw from the Edible Schoolyard, enables students with different skill profiles, let's call it, different interests, things that they're good at, to, again, to all work together.
Where do you see service learning fitting in with today's education?
Well, very much along the lines of project-based learning. The best service learning is rigorous project-based learning, where you're providing a service to your community. Maybe you're doing it in another location, another state, another country. You see these service learning projects going on, but where it's not just volunteerism, but it's connected to the curriculum about math and science, history, culture. It's very powerful because then you're not only learning the core curriculum and you're creating a project, but you're also providing a service. So whether it's, one of my favorite ones is a lot of environmental projects related to measurement of clean air, clean water, beach cleanup, the oceans, how much time do we have? The oceans.
We don't have any oceans in Kansas.
Yeah. I will simply say that we can't have a green world unless we have a blue world. Yeah, so the lakes, the water quality, all that is connected. So, yeah, doing environmental projects, great example of service learning to improve your local environment and ecosystem, but also very connected to rigorous project-based learning. I should say we have some great examples of that on our Edutopia website about students studying their own communities. We've redesigned an AP Environmental Science course to do this kind of service learning. Yes?
Hi. As we exit the world of No Child Left Behind and the fidelity to rigorous testing and the scoring and all of that, what advice do you have for policymakers about the role that we get a lot is accountability? You can't put money into the system to do these exciting things unless there's accountability. So what advice do you offer on how this new world of project-based learning and individualized learning plays into a redesigned system?
Yeah, that's a really good question because as you've seen, we've collected story after story. It looks like the kids are having a lot of fun. They're enjoying it. But does it really work? And what is the assessment of learning? So changing how we think about assessment is probably the most important thing we can do as a nation and as states. Moving away from just the multiple choice, they call them bubble tests, which focus more on factual information, whether you know certain facts. The real question is, can you apply those facts in your learning through project-based learning? So we've been working at the Lucas Educational Foundation on a project, and you can see it under Lucas Education Research, to redesign courses for project-based learning, but still with the rigorous assessment. We've been working on advanced placement courses, for instance. There you have it. If you can do advanced placement courses, which are kind of the gold standard for high school students, that means they can do college-level work. If you can do that through this more creative, collaborative, project-based learning, the initial results are pretty positive about that. We can show, for example, that students taking the AP U.S. Government and Politics course and the AP Environmental Science course do as well or better on the AP score alone. What's a pass is a 3, 4, or 5 on a 5-point scale. A high pass is a 4 or a 5. That our students doing this project-based learning, this is in partnership with university researchers around the country, Michigan, Stanford, elsewhere, that they do as well or better on the standardized test, but they do much, much better on these other measures of deeper learning, for instance, interest in that subject. Do you want to take another college course on environmental science, on U.S. government? They do much better on those measures. So changing the assessments, we've been working with the College Board on that, trying to come up with other, we call them performance-based assessments. I talk a lot about connecting the world of schools with the world of work. You can just ask the same question about how do we assess performance in the workplace. It's performance-based. You get feedback from people you're working with. There's a path to improvement. These are the sorts of things we want to bring into school systems. Probably more expensive than just taking a quick multiple choice test, but it is the kind of assessment that helps students and teachers improve. These multiple choice tests, you take the test in the spring and you don't even get the results until the fall, maybe. What can you do in the interest of improvement? There's not much there. So it's more of a continuous cycle of performance-based assessment. Many other countries have done this, so we have other systems to point to. Yes?
Just a little off track, but you talked about initiatives, assessments, points of emphasis, and that sort of thing. I know you have a knowledge of imagination and such. And I wonder, it'd be very hard to assess, but to me, humor is an important thing for a student, to understand it, enjoy it, or be part of it. Or maybe it's just lightheartedness. And it seems to me there's a potential as we dig deeper and go more in the academic parts of things and what we want to do, that sometimes there's a self-imposed or another imposition of pressure. And I worry about the pressure that the students have, and don't know if I can make a point here other than Can lightheartedness or humor,
Yeah,
imagination play a bigger
yeah.
part?
We touched on some of those ideas in talking about social emotional learning. That comes under this category of knowing yourself and how you want to be more resilient, for instance, that if you encounter difficulties or make mistakes, encounter failure, that you can respond to that. You're resilient, and maybe with a sense of humor, maybe with a sense of lightness, as you're suggesting. So we're hoping that more students understand this. I showed earlier a website that I like called the Academy of Achievement, where very distinguished people talk about their careers, including George Lucas, and how they got to where they are. And often, when they faced with making mistakes or failure, they responded with a lightheartedness, learning from that, not just saying, oh my gosh, I'm terrible at this, not getting depressed about not doing well in a certain course. Frank Gehry flunked his first architecture class. So, yeah, I think that's important to communicate to students, that the spirit of learning, of curiosity, of hopefully humor is something important to maintain.
Dr. Chen, thank you for meeting with our students today. I hope they exceeded your expectations.
Oh, they were marvelous.
We have a tremendous community support and industry contributions to our classrooms. What kind of advice would you give to teachers to bridge the generational gap from the Twitter, Snapchat generation to those industry experts that are 30-year engineers with vast experience? What would you tell a teacher to help those two generations come together?
Do you mean bringing in industry experts who have had long careers and bringing them into schools?
When you have them at the table,
Mm-hmm.
a 30-year industry expert and a 16-year-old engineer wannabe who's busy on Twitter and Snapchat, breaking that ice, bridging that communication gap, if you will.
Yeah, there is kind of a digital gap there, isn't there? We see it all the time. And I think, again, as we talked about some of these earlier ideas that harken back to an earlier age, one of the things we're trying to communicate more to students is their time is valuable. How they spend their time. Hopefully more directed towards learning rather than just socializing. Some of the figures and surveys on the amount of time students spend on screens are astonishing. Watching screens of all sizes and shapes in all places, on average students are spending 7 to 8 hours a day on screen time. Being able to put down the screen when you're having a conversation. I like this idea of mealtime is not technology time. You put your phones in the middle of the table and that's it. But trying to communicate to students that there is a much larger world out there than just the world of socializing. And I think we're beginning to see some of the pushback around social media. Facebook and Twitter can be used for very positive social purposes, but also can take up a lot of time that could be better spent, I'll put it that way. So helping students understand the value of their time, it's still just 24 hours in a day, and gaining some wisdom from folks who've had long careers. I'm one of them, I'm in my 60s. We wish that we had access to the tools that they have now. We can imagine a very different use of them than what most students are doing with social media, so yeah.
Thank you so much for being here tonight.
No,
Thanks
thank you, Kim.
all of you for coming and for supporting us. And we really appreciate your time spent with our students. I think it was really incredible, and with our educators. So again, thank you, Dr. Milton Chen.
Thank you. Thank you for supporting this district.